Hey everybody, welcome back. This here is Ghost Stories Episode 3. We're going to talk about the ghostly hornpipe. Once isolated and accessible only with difficulty, the charming village of Ocracoke is now known to most Carolina vacationers, if only as a prime spot for a summer holiday. Their time does indeed sometimes seem to stand still. Not so familiar is what had been preserved in the town of Portsmouth, just across Ocracoke Inlet from the village. Now only a memory, Portsmouth was at one time a very important port of entry for ocean-going commerce. The region was already growing steadily at the beginning of the 18th century. Hatteras Inlet to the north was shoaling up, and more sea traffic began to use Portsmouth. Ocracoke Inlet, then as now, was very tricky and changeable, and a local pilot was needed to bring an incoming vessel past the sandbars and shoals. For this reason, there grew up a straggling tent city near the present site of Ocracoke Village, which was populated by professional pilots who knew the inlet well. They located here to be on the lookout night and day for incoming merchant ships needing a local pilot. Portsmouth was the destination of these vessels, and the wharves and docks, chandleries and saloons and stores of that city welcomed the weary seamen. Pilot City, later to become Ocracoke Village, was temporary lodging for the pilots. Most of them maintained homes in or near Portsmouth. Fishing was also an important industry, and the nearby Gulf Stream and adjacent waters usually provided abundant catches of very marketable fish. Even the inedible Manhattan, still known locally as fatback, was much in demand in the fall and early summers. Farmers planting their successive crops of corn followed the ancient practice of the friendly Indians, from whom they first learned about this exclusively American grain. From the beginning, the Indians planted a raw fish in each hill of corn, along with 4 grains of seed. An Indian legend revolved around this practice, and today we realize that this timeless method provided the corn with excellent fertilizer. Thence came the colonial rhyme that the farmer often repeated as he dropped the 4 grains in the hill: one for the raven and one for the crow, one to rot and one to grow. One of the most successful commercial fishermen of Portsmouth town was a man named Jesse Hawkins. He was very energetic and resourceful, and was usually among the leaders of these farmers of the sea. He was economical, almost to the point of stinginess, and was an expert at making do with equipment long after most seafarers would have replaced it with new. A typical example was his schooner, the Taurus, which he had purchased in Charleston some years before from the widow of a fisherman. Well built, she was admirably suited for the task of offshore fishing, but most of her equipment was already old when Hawkins bought her. Her standing rig was frayed in places, and her suit of sails had seen better days. Her anchor cable was an ancient hemp hawser, thick as a man's thigh. It looked strong enough to anchor a continent, but it had held through many a gale, and now groaned whenever even a moderate amount of strain was put on the anchor. Her ribs seemed sound, however, and her holds were of ample size to contain large hauls of fish. She was put to use almost the year round, as her catches followed the changing seasons. Although he was known as a sometimes reckless skipper, Hawkins had little difficulty in obtaining a competent crew. He was known to be a fair man, if a hard driver, and his crews usually prospered as he prospered. Competition among the fishing vessels was intense but friendly. Most of the fishing was done on shares, as the captain and the crew shared the proceeds from whatever catch they made. Although the captain was in full command, the crew had a vested interest in the success or failure of each trip. Often the difference between a highly successful voyage and a commonplace one was the luck or the hustle of getting to the offshore fishing grounds early. The more successful skippers put to sea in the late afternoon and anchored overnight on the edge of the best fishing spots to await the daylight. Thus, it was that on the first night of the full moon in November of 1714, the schooner Taurus was anchored just inside the outer slough, waiting for the first light of day to begin what they hoped should be, by all the signs and portents, a successful fishing trip. Several hundred yards to the south of the schooner, the sloop Good Fortune rode easily to her anchor in the increasing swells. Much smaller than the Taurus, but much newer and more nimble. She was captained by young Arthur Newby, another of the more able fishermen of Portsmouth. He, too, had gone out early to be on hand near the best fishing spots. When the expected heavy run of fish began, the crews of each vessel could see the lights of the other as they rose and fell with the motion of the sea. It is strange indeed that neither of the captains noticed the steady falling of the glass, as the barometers were called. Both were accustomed to the frequent, sudden changes in the weather at this time of year, but perhaps they were both preoccupied. Even so, the growing size of the waves which now began to break over the shoals should have alerted them to the fact that something was up weather-wise. Maybe they anticipated only a brief squall, which they could handle with ease. One by one the stars were blotted out by the incoming line of clouds, and the moon itself grew dimmer and dimmer, and finally was completely obscured by the cloud bank. No lights whatsoever were visible in the blackness, except for the anchor lights of the two vessels, and an occasional wave of phosphorescent fire in the depths of the sea. The wind song slowly changed from a low moan to a higher and higher pitched scream as the full force of the winter storm struck. All hands were called up on deck on both vessels as the experienced seamen sought to secure all loose gear and ready their craft for the full impact of the blow. It was not long in coming. Line squalls are infamous for the brute force of their initial attack, and this one was unusually fierce, even for November in this graveyard of ships. Both captains elected to stay at anchor rather than cut loose and run before the storm. As the seas grew higher and higher, both craft jerked more and more forcibly against their anchors, and even experienced sailors were thrown to the deck. Both vessels were securely anchored, and both tried to pay out a bit more anchor cable to ease the snatching caused by the waves. Suddenly, and with an ear-splitting crack, the anchor cable of the Taurus parted under the strain, and the large schooner was at the mercy of the wind and surf. "Release the jib!" roared Captain Hawkins, and his crew sprang to unfurl the foremost of the sails to gain some control. The jib sail failed and bellied out in the gale all right, and was beginning to bring the bow of the ship downward. But in the next instant it split wide open with a sound like that of a cannon firing. The foresail suffered the same fate. As the old canvas could not withstand the full force of the storm, Taurus was a derelict out of control and directly upwind, now from the anchored Good Fortune. Captain Hawkins could do nothing at this point to control his vessel as she bore down headlong upon the smaller Good Fortune. Seeing the danger, Captain Newby cast off from his anchor and was beginning to turn his vessel around, but in the instant that she was broadside, the Taurus, the larger schooner, struck her amidships and rolled her over and over under its keel, cutting her almost in two and sinking her with all hands. Hawkins threw overboard all his life preservers and some of his hatch covers in the faint hope that some members of the crew could be saved, but it was to no avail. Taurus, brought up on a sandbar off a lee shore on the southern end of Portsmouth Island, she was easily refloated 2 days later with no loss of life. Under a jury rig, she limped back into Portsmouth Harbor and was later repaired and refitted at the ship's chandlery there. Some of the wreckage of the Good Fortune washed up on the southern shore of the island, but no bodies were ever recovered. As the details of the wreck spread through the port, there was some muttering among the seamen against Captain Hawkins. "He should have replaced the anchor cable long ago," some said. "He's to blame me for the drowning of them poor lads, and he's the one what sent 'em to their deaths, unshriven and unburied, to roll about the bottom of the sea till kingdom come. He ought to be brought to account," others whispered. Poor dears, they'll never rest." Most of the townfolk defended the captain. No one could know that the great cable would fail. After all, they argued he was an experienced captain, and surely he would not have placed his own life in danger if he had ever dreamed that such a thing could happen. Time went by. The Taurus was refitted with all new cordage and a brand new suit of sails, and the day came when she was ready to put to sea again. Captain Hawkins had visited all the families of the dead crewmen and expressed his sorrow at the tragedy. The families were used to danger and to tragedy on the sea, and they reassured him that they in no way held him to blame. Well, the schooner was ready, and Captain Hawkins was ready, and so plans were made to return to the business of fishing, to try to recoup the heavy expense of refitting the vessel. He had not the slightest difficulty in recruiting the same crew of experienced seamen who had sailed with him before. Late one sunny afternoon, they put out again through Ocracoke Inlet and out to sea. Once again they anchored near the same spot as before to wait for the first light of day. They all agreed it was an excellent place to begin a day's fishing. In the murky light just before dawn, they set their nets and marked the place with net buoys. The sea seemed to be alive with fish, and they anticipated sharing in a near-record catch. All day long they left those nets in place, and as the sunny afternoon turned into the early darkness of November, they prepared to haul them in. Prepared is all they did. As they began to haul in the line attached to the net, the whole sea and the deck of their ship was suddenly bathed in a mysterious greenish light. There, in that ghostly light on the deck, they beheld, to their horror, the spirits of the dead seamen from the Little Good Fortune. Without a word, the ghosts began to haul in the nets and dump the catch into the hold of the schooner. With precision, they performed all duties that go with bringing such nets aboard and emptying them. All the laboring fishermen had obviously drowned. They had wet hair streaming down to their waists, gaping mouths, and sightless, staring eyes. They made no sound, but each ghost went about his task with the sureness and skill of much experience. They worked together to secure the catch like the well-trained team they were. The crew of the Taurus could only cower against the mast and the cabin and stare at this apparition with wild and frantic eyes. Many repeatedly crossed themselves and pleaded aloud for divine protection. As the last bite of the net was emptied into the hold, there came a brilliant flash of blue-green light, and then utter darkness, and silence except for the gentle swish of the seas running alongside the ship. The ghosts of the drowned seamen vanished as quickly as they had come. A trembling Captain Hawkins gave the orders to bring his vessel about. In silence he conned her through the inlet and to the dockside in Portsmouth. Once safely docked, he got a lighted lantern and went down into the hold of his ship to estimate his catch. There was not one single fish in the craft. Not one fish of any kind. The hold of the Taurus was as empty as when he had set out on the venture. Some of the crew crowded down into the hold behind him and cried out in disbelief and wonder. The nets were strewn about the deck, but none of them was torn or in any way the worse for wear. There were no fish, but with their own eyes the crew had seen thousands of them dumped into the hold. Captain Jesse Hawkins was able to obtain crews for just 2 more fishing trips offshore. The first crew was a full crew, although it contained none of his original personnel. The same thing happened, although they fished an entirely different area of ocean. The same ghostly group of men fished the nets with exactly the same results. Nothing. The second crew was really about half a crew, just enough men to handle the schooner, and several of them were drunk by the time they came aboard. No matter. The outcome was exactly the same, and they made the trip back to the safety of the dock in record time. After that, no one would sail with Captain Hawkins again. The Taurus stayed tied up to the wharf and gradually rotted away from neglect. She grew less and less seaworthy as shipwrights refused to work on her and prospective buyers would have none of her. Finally, she rotted away and sank at her moorings. No effort was ever made to salvage anything from her or to remove her. She was truly a landlocked derelict. The haunted captain disappeared from Portsmouth town and was never seen there again. Some say that he took up piracy as a crewman aboard one of the pirate raiders, which began to become more numerous a short time later. Others claimed that he committed suicide and that at his end the devil was there to claim him. At any rate, he was never heard from again. Not so the Taurus. There were people who swore that if you went to the spot where she had sunk on any moonlit midnight in the month of November, you could see a strange ghostly light illuminating her sunken decks. There by the light, you would see a terrifying sight. Back and forth upon the sodden and rotted decks, they say the drowned fishermen of the Good Fortune dance a macabre dance, a sailor's hornpipe. Back and forth and round they dance in an intricate sort of quadrille which for centuries has been the sailor's dance. There is old Pegleg Henry with his accordion playing the tune. The leader of the hornpipe appears to be One-Eyed Jack Austin with his black eye patch. These and all the other departed comrades, whom the people of Portsmouth town had known as so well, all the people who knew these departed fishermen are themselves dead now, and Portsmouth town is but a ghost of its former busy, bustling self. Just a few structures have been preserved for posterity to see and admire. Some people contend that the ghostly hornpipe continues to this day. They claim that if you can get the operator of a small boat to take you to the spot on any November night with a bright moon, you will be rewarded with a strange sight. Gaze down into the deep water where the Taurus finally went to rest, and they aver that you will see the ghosts and watch their hornpipe. They say that this will continue until the day of judgment, when the souls of those poor drowned crewmen and their captain will receive the peace and rest they so desperately desire. All right, you guys, this is a story to the guest. Many years ago, two young friends had a very unusual experience. When the two were old enough to seek their fortunes, it became necessary for them to go their separate ways. Before they separated, they promised each other that if either should marry, he would invite the other to his wedding. Sometime later, one of the young men, Francis, died, and the other, Marion, was to be married. On his wedding day, Marion kept his promise and went to the grave of his friend to invite him to his wedding. Soon after he had made the invitation, Francis was standing beside him. The two then left for the wedding, and after the wedding ceremony, Francis asked Marion to come with him to his wedding, for he too was to be married on that day. The two went directly from one wedding to the other, but the latter took place in a beautiful hall. There was magnificent music in the background which overwhelmed those present. After the musician had played one piece, Francis told Marion that it was time for him to leave, but Marion insisted on another piece and then another. After the conclusion of the third piece, he was persuaded to leave. When he arrived home, he noticed that a great change had taken place in his hometown during his absence. He could not understand the change, for it seemed he had been gone only a short while. He saw a young man along the road and began questioning him. The man did not know who Marion was, nor did he know any of the people about whom he was asked. Marion learned that a story of a man who had left his wedding and had never returned was well known among the residents of this town. When he asked the location of the house of this man, he was shown a group of trees and told that the house no longer stood there, for the incident had taken place 300 years earlier. Marion could not believe his ears, yet it was true. His presence in the beautiful hall had had a strange effect upon him. Every time the musician had played for what seemed only a few minutes, 100 years had passed. It seemed incredible that the magnificence and splendor of the unknown place had had the power to make 100 years seem like a few minutes. But Marion knew that it had happened. All right, story 3, you guys. Hatteras Jack. For as many years as there have been deep water sailors, man has been fascinated by and strangely drawn to porpoises. Long before the advent of the internal combustion marine engine, and while navigators were still in bondage to the vagaries of wind and current, a rather large body of half-truth and half-legend grew up about these playful and intelligent kings of the deep. Australia, for example, boasted of a very unusual specimen who, not which, mind you, but who met the early sailing ships carrying the prisoner colonists to new homes on that continent and led the ships safely into sheltered anchorage. Hatteras Jack, at this purposeful porpoise was called, is as much a part of Australian legend as is the Jolly Swagman and his Jimbuck. At about the same time, or possibly a little later in history, the exact times are not very clear, the Outer Banks of North Carolina had a similar phenomenon. Whereas the Australian porpoise was the standard brown and black, the Hatteras version was almost snow white, a rare albino specimen. Whereas Hatteras Jack apparently contented himself with meeting and guiding inbound vessels. Hatteras Jack was a more versatile performer and greatly endeared himself not only to the pilots of Hatteras-bound vessels, but to the permanent residents of those parts as well. With the exception of the short-lived porpoise fishery on Portsmouth Island, which was conceived and operated by outlanders for a few short months, with only a few native boatmen as employees, the love affair between porpoises and the Outer Bankers has continued to this day. North Carolina's Outer Banks are pierced at intervals by inlets where the waters of the Atlantic Ocean and the coastal sounds meet. Since the first attempts to settle this country, seafaring men have used these inlets to gain access to the mainland. Many of these inlets, known to ancient mariners, have gradually closed up, so that they no longer exist except as names on very old maps. Examples of these are Raleigh's Inlet, which is said to have been located about 9 miles north of the present Oregon Inlet, and more recently, Caffey's Inlet, which used to exist a few miles north of the town of Duck. Other openings in the banks appear to have become fairly permanent either by the action of a man in stabilizing them or by the relatively fixed set of the currents that sweep through them. Such are Beaufort Inlet, which served the port of Morehead City, and Hatteras and Oregon Inlets to the north. Even with the best efforts of the man and the relative predictability of the permanent currents, most inlets are treacherous and dangerous to shipping unless a local pilot cons the helm to avoid the ever-shifting shoals and reefs. This is true even in this day of sonar, warning buoys, and flashing lights. It was true to an even greater degree in the days before these aids to navigation. In the days of the pirate Blackbeard, Ocracoke Inlet was the customary gateway for ships wishing to come to a safe anchor on the North Carolina coast. The town of Portsmouth was booming on the south shore of that inlet and was the trading center for the whole area. To the north lay Silver Lake, a safe and landlocked haven for the careening of ships. Later, the majority of this traffic moved to Hatteras Inlet, some 15 miles to the north. And this inlet remained the favorite of many years thereafter. It was here that the Confederate forts were built, and here that the sea-born Yankee invasion of the Civil War took place. Between the Revolution and the Civil War, Hatteras Inlet held the vast majority of the ships and shipping trade for most of eastern Carolina. This inlet, closest to the graveyard of the Atlantic, was then and remains today one of the most difficult to navigate. The topography of the sea and inlet bottom are constantly changing, and what may be a deep channel today can well be a dangerous reef next week. Most ships need deep water to stay afloat, at least deeper than the 2 or 3 feet over these ever-moving shoals and reefs. Deep water there is in the Hatteras Inlet, but it is confined to a twisting, turning, and ever-changing channel. Snake-like, it is in its complicated convolutions and continuous motion. Now imagine, if you can, the dilemma of those antebellum captains with no auxiliary motor and only the power of the wind to propel them. They would creep with shortened sail into this inlet, with a sailor stationed in the chains, constantly heaving the lead line and calling out the decreasing depth, and with a lookout at the masthead, pointing out the breakers ahead. It is remarkable that any skipper would even attempt the passage. It was about the year 1790 that help arrived upon the scene in the person of Hatteras Jack. Now, according to the tales that Hatteras men tell, when the winter winds are howling and they are sitting snug ashore around their warm stoves, Hatteras Jack was just as real as Edward Teach and a sight more helpful. While other porpoises contented themselves with sporting about the breakers and being mistaken for mermaids, Jack had a purpose in life. That self-imposed duty, that high calling to which he was devoted, was the leading of ships into and out of Hatteras Inlet. He was the self-appointed pilot, and he never lost a ship during all of his long career. Captains of inbound ships would lie to off the inlet, or else track back and forth and wait for Hatteras Jack to put in an appearance. With the coming of high tide, there he would be, leaping clear of the water and swimming in figure eights, his friendly grin just awash in the blue-green waters. With a single prolonged blast on the ship's foghorn and an answering series of high-pitched squeaks from Jack, the piloting would begin, slowly now, so that the sailing boat would have no trouble in keeping up. Jack would head into the channel. Slowly he would swim through the various twists and turns of the channel of the day, his white back gleaming just under the surface and the sailing vessel following in his wake. Carefully keeping to the very center of the deep water, Hatteras Jack would lead the vessel past the shoals, past the reefs, around the fishhook-shaped tip of Hatteras Island, and into the relatively safe waters of the Sound. Once the escorted ship had come to rest and had let go her anchors with a roar of unwinding chain, the albino porpoise would go into a transport of glee, apparently to having concluded another successful mission. Unless there was another ship awaiting him outside the bar, he would then proceed to put on a show of tail walking on the surface of the water, of complicated leaps and flips into the air, and of swift dartings and barrel rolls just under the surface. Hatteras Jack never sought and apparently did not expect any sort of reward from his human friends for services rendered. About the only reward he would have been interested in, anyway, it was said, would have been a fish or two. But he was a much more accomplished fisherman than any human. The satisfaction of a job well done and the rendering of aid that only he could give are believed to have been the motivating reasons for his work. There are many things that man does not yet understand about porpoises. The instances of help that have been given man by this most intelligent of marine animals are legion and as yet not fully explained. The story goes that our albino porpoise would carefully appraise each ship before undertaking the responsibility of guiding her into the inlet. If a ship appeared to be larger or more heavily laden than usual, and thus deeper in the water, it is said that Hatteras Jack would literally take her measurements by diving on her port side, traversing the outline of her hull underwater and then surfacing on her starboard side, thus having sensed her draft and knowing well the depth of the water in the channel. He would know just how full the tide must be for that particular vessel to make a safe trip through the tricky channel. No matter how many blasts were sounded on the foghorn, our guiding porpoise would steadfastly refuse to begin the trip until the tide had risen to a safe depth. While awaiting that hour, it is said he would normally put on a show for the crew of the waiting ship, sometimes alone and sometimes in company with other porpoises. He would exhibit the tremendous agility that porpoises possess and the keen sense of humor they are known to have. There were times, too, when he would engage in fights to the death with his mortal enemy, the shark. These combats were as spectacular as they were terrifying. Almost as much of the combat took place just above the surface of the water as occurred beneath it. The superior speed and intelligence of Hatteras Jack always brought him out the victor. And although the shark had terrible teeth and a savage will to fight, he was just no match for the porpoise. This, then, is the story of Hatteras Jack, pilot, entertainer, warrior, and friend to man. This is the legend that has been handed down from generation to generation. This, plus the Outer Bankers' own happy experiences and encounters with present-day porpoises, is the reason why no real Outer Banker, native or adopted, will harm these creatures or permit them to be harmed if such harm can be prevented. Call them bottlenose dolphins if you like. They are not fish but mammals, which breathe air as we do, bear their young alive and nurse them at the breast, talk with each other in their own language, and have their own highly organized communities with laws which are rigidly obeyed. The brain of this remarkable animal is just as convoluted and complex as is the brain of man, and it is a great deal larger. One wonders what might have happened if the porpoise had had the advantage of an opposable thumb. But maybe he is much happier and better off as he is. After buoys, lights, and bells or horns were put on platforms out in the inlet to mark the channel, Hatteras Jack just disappeared. He came back, they say, a time or two afterwards, as though he were checking all this newfangled equipment to see if it was really effective. He actually led a boat through the channel once in a while, as though to keep his fin in. His visits grew less frequent, however, and he finally stopped coming at all. But many still remember him and speak of him with love and gratitude. He is part and parcel of their tradition. He, too, was a real Outer Banker.